Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. Today, one of Canada's foremost experts on Arctic security and contemporary northern policy, and CDA Institute Fellow, Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer, examines some critical aspects of Arctic security. Key topics today include a recent incident involving a Canadian warship and a Chinese research vessel in the Bering Strait, NORAD modernization, the new Canada-Finland-US icebreaker pact, burden sharing, and more. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. This is the Expert Series. Dr. Lackenbauer, thanks for joining me today for the Expert Series. This has been a pretty long time coming. This is your first appearance on the program. You've been a CDA Institute Fellow for a while, so I'm glad we've been finally able to do this. Today we'll be taking a pretty broad but also deep dive into various facets of Arctic security. So why don't we go ahead with the first question?
What are your thoughts on maybe the challenges and opportunities for burden sharing between Canada and the U.S. regarding Arctic security defense, especially in light of the recent NATO summit and announcements such as the U.S.-Finland-Canada ICE pact?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Interesting question. So I think there's a lot of alignment between Canadian and American interests in the Arctic. Particularly, we're talking about what I like to categorize as threats through the Arctic. And when I explain that, it's sort of thinking about, we often bundle together Arctic defense and security. And I like to parse and say, are we talking about threats that will pass through the Arctic to strike at targets in the rest of North America, let's say? So we're talking missile threats, we're talking bombers, in theory, a whole range of delivery systems and weapons that are really related to global competition. And obviously, by virtue of our longstanding binational command with the Americans, North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, and a whole bunch of other bilateral relationships, we really are premier partners together. And I think a lot of what we've seen, not only the very recently released U.S. Arctic defense strategy, but also Canada's defense policy update, North Strong and Free, which came out in April, we see a lot of complementarity and a lot of reinforcing priorities. So in the case of the U.S., you brought up NATO, I think it's a really foundational document, not only for the United States, but also for its key allies, including Canada, thinking about how burden sharing, and this really is shared alliance responsibilities that come together when we're talking about what is a very diverse Arctic space. Like, I think from a Canadian standpoint, we think often in terms of the North American Arctic or the Canadian Arctic, but the US document also says the European Arctic and European High North is a very different operating environment by virtue of the Gulf Stream. It's not ice covered for most of the year. Topographically, it may resemble some parts of especially the North American subarctic, but is rather different. So from that standpoint, working with allies and figuring out how we're reinforcing extends beyond North America. So I suggest that while North Strong and Free says that the most important and urgent task for the Canadian military is Arctic sovereignty, I would actually suggest that we should swap out sovereignty, which is a very inward focused and very defensive mindset in terms of Canada, and instead talk about security. And Arctic security is something in which we really are best suited to focus on working with allies. And when we look at recent suggestions that we are progressing towards 2% of GDP, we factor in the submarines that we're still, I think, exploring technically, but Minister Blair did indicate are something that we're working towards. I think this will help to signal that Canada really is serious about providing not only for our own defense, but at the same time for that shared defense of North America, the defense of the homeland piece. And again, I don't see there being friction points between Canada and the U.S. You mentioned as well the recently announced pact between the United States, Canada, and Finland in terms of icebreaker procurement. I think that's definitely in the security rather than defense part of the operational mission spectrum or defense security continuum, but really positive, I think, in flagging that we have expertise across our alliance. And I love being able to say that with respect to Finland and Sweden now, have expertise across the alliance. So rather than thinking that we as Canadians or North Americans need to have all the expertise in terms of icebreaking, we can work with the Finns, who are absolutely world leaders in design and construction and work together and build off of one another's respective strengths. And to me, that at the end of the day is what burden sharing is at its core. It's not just about having redundant capabilities. Sometimes those are appropriate, but it's also seeing where do we have certain equities or certain strengths where we can take on responsibilities, and that frees up our allies. So especially within the U.S. construct, it's really important. A lot of their orientation is towards the Indo-Pacific. It's the pacing threat of China. They obviously have to deal with a resurgent, very aggressive and misbehaving Russia. But at the same time, that's a lot of the emphasis on the Europeans picking up a lot of that burden. So to me, it's natural that Canada will be expected to take on more of the North American Arctic responsibility for detecting and deterring.
You brought up the DPU. You also brought up all the work we're doing with our allies, joint exercises. Do you anticipate that these planned joint exercises and collaboration could potentially improve Canada's capabilities in the region? And what other benefits or challenges might arise from such efforts?
Yeah, excellent. So yes, I think absolutely. We flagged back in the 2017 Defense Policy Strong, Secure, Engaged, the importance of doing exercise with allies, which I think is something that's always been in place, but it shows how at the sort of dominant framework in Canadian circles of Arctic sovereignty can actually be quite limiting. So in my mind, the mindset is if you're fixated entirely on sovereignty, demonstrating your independent or autonomous capabilities to achieve certain effects, right? It downplays the benefits of working with allies and partners. But when we look at Operation Nanook, sort of Canada's year-round flagship series of exercises, we've involved allied partners for well more than a decade now. So seeing in Strong, Secure, Engaged, and now in Our Strong and Free, a real affirmation of the value of working with allies, and not only Canadians participating in NATO or US exercises in the Arctic, but also inviting those allies to come and participate in ours, is a show of solidarity. And one thing that has come out of, Russia's brutal, illegal, unprovoked, full invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 is solidarity within the alliance, an expanded alliance, of course, more than we've ever seen before. This plays out in the Arctic. And I think working together, we really can demonstrate that there are no gaps and seams between us, that any would-be adversary who's thinking that the Arctic is a place where they can go and try to divide us, it's not going to happen. In terms of practical, operational, and tactical effects, I think as well, the opportunities through exercises to learn from allies about different best practices and to think about how we're going to synchronize all our efforts is really important. And in and of itself, that's an incredibly significant strategic message to be delivering to competitors. I think there's a tendency, not just in Canada, but amongst the Arctic, 7 like-minded Arctic states, to sometimes downplay our strengths and capabilities in the Arctic as a way of trying to embarrass our political leaders to invest in enhanced defense capabilities. I think the unfortunate flip side of that is it sends a strategic message to competitors that we're weak and that we're exploitable and that there are gaps and seams. So I see exercising as a really strong way of sending strategic messages, very coherent messages to adversaries, competitors, that we are actually strong and working together. There is no adversary out there who has a preponderance of power that they can go and use to intimidate us, particularly in the Arctic. So I think this is a really significant shift in emphasis, and one that I very much welcome as a Canadian, saying that it is actually an exercising of our sovereignty to invite allies to come and work with us, within Canada, and for Canada to go and work with our allies elsewhere. And this is something that the Americans have flagged as one of their key priorities, one of the 3 main themes in their defense strategy, which is exercising, and particularly the alliance piece.
The NORAD modernization program includes significant investments that will come to improve the surveillance systems in the far north, as I'm sure you know. Yet, as we witness growing activities in the region, many Arctic surveillance systems planned in the NORAD modernization, such as Arctic over-the-horizon radar and polar over-the-horizon radar, are deemed not to be in their initial phase of operation before at least 2028. Keeping in mind these facts, how would you say Canada could effectively address immediate security concerns in the Arctic while maybe awaiting the deployment of some of these more advanced systems?
Well, thanks, Josh. And again, here's where I think framing, the Arctic threat environment and what is that dynamic security space in the Arctic in global and then circumpolar regional, and then, national or subnational frames is really important. So NORAD primarily is looking outward at global dynamics that have spillover effects in the Arctic. So here's where the Arctic as an avenue of approach to North America, something that's been recognized as being for throughout the Cold War right to today, is still relevant and is becoming more relevant as we look at competitors who are developing advanced delivery systems, whether it's cruise missiles, glide vehicles. These are things that require, first of all, an ability to detect in order to deter, either through deterrence by punishment or deterrence by denial. And often we're thinking these days about deterrence by denial. So preventing those delivery systems from actually passing through the Arctic and striking at targets in North America, right? The Arctic is really key to detecting and potentially being part of those defeat systems. But I think there are misconceptions that the Arctic itself and competition within the Arctic is actually the cause of heightened tensions or risk to North America. And I'm just a skeptic of that. The Arctic is absolutely important as part of our broader strategic defense in depth, right? Having both the Arctic and polar over the horizon radar, right? One covering Canada's Arctic, North American Arctic, the other extending literally over the pole to be able to go and perhaps collect advance warning of say launches or other activities in say the Russian Arctic, right? These are significantly important, but not because, as I see it, the Arctic is going to cause or generate conflict, or the Arctic is going to be a particular target of a kinetic, so like a conventional military attack from the Russians or the Chinese. So again, I'll leave it to some of the strategic analysts who are privy to intelligence that I would never, have access to as an academic to determine the pace at which we need to be deploying these systems in full. But I think it's also sort of important for us to not lose our coherence or clarity in understanding why we need to go and proceed with these developments and not wait in perpetuity and push them off. And if anything, build back to your fundamental question about a lot of the NORAD modernization initiatives. All of us, I think, analysts in this community were sort of struck by how long the delivery times were. And I think one of the keys is I don't think we're in a crisis moment right now in terms of Arctic security, where if we don't have these systems in the next 3 years, Canadians are imperiled and North Americans are in incredibly grave danger compared to where we've been in the past. But I think we need to have a sense of urgency. And to me, urgency means, yes, we need to have the right relationships. We need to make sure we're delivering. We need to make sure we're doing so at the speed of relevance. And that, I think, is something that Washington is expecting of us, right? Washington doesn't dictate what Canada does, but they are an anchor to our concept of what defense of our homeland looks like. So making sure that we're well synchronized with the Americans and that we're delivering our parts of this shared North American defense at the speed of relevance is absolutely critical.
Well, thanks, Whitney. You've brought up our allies to the south and our close friends, the United States, a few times. So in 2021, the Department of Defense created the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies based in Alaska. And its goal, just for our audience, is to enhance regional and global security by uniting military and civilian experts from the U.S. and Arctic allies to develop collaborative solutions that incorporate Arctic Indigenous perspectives. With this said, what are your thoughts, Whitney, on this initiative? And do you believe it could potentially represent an opportunity for Canada to further foster collaboration with the United States regarding Arctic security?
Yes, absolutely, Josh. I'm very fortunate, I think very honored to have a close relationship with the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. And through that, I think it's still taking shape as one of the latest of the Department of Defense's, so U.S. Department of Defense's regional centers. In the latest Arctic defense strategy produced by the Pentagon, it's highlighted as being really important in enhancing our understanding of the Arctic environment. It's a real opportunity for the United States to play a leadership role in bringing allies together in terms of thinking about the changing Arctic defense and security environment. Really fortunate as the as leading and serving the North American Arctic Defense and Security Network, which is funded by our Department of National Defense, to have partnered with the Ted Stevens Center and the group focusing on defense and security at Ilisimattu-Sarfik at the University of Greenland on a North American Arctic security workshop hosted in Iqaluit in May. And I think that's a great example of, as part of an annual cycle of workshops involving Canadians, Kingdom of Denmark, Greenland, and the Ted Stevens Center representing Alaskans and all Americans, coming together and really having conversations that are thinking more broadly about North American security. And so I see great opportunity space with the Ted Stevens Center to be this footprint, or to be this hub that brings together a diverse group of experts to think about where we can learn from one another and where we're going to achieve the best outcomes by really investing in collaborative efforts. So exciting initiative, and I think great opportunities for not just NADSN, but CDAI and others in the Canadian space to work with the Americans and other allies and really invigorate a lot of the discussions.
How would you conceptualize the interplay between climate change and Arctic security? And what are your thoughts on the attention this issue has received in recent policy discussions and documents, such as the DPU, published back in April?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So many thoughts on the climate change piece, right? We'd almost say that in just about every strategic document produced by any of the like-minded Arctic states, there's often this correlation between climate change and the fact that the region is warming at sort of 3 times the global average, was the stat cited in Canada's Defense Policy Update, as well as the U.S. strategy, that this is leading to increased accessibility. And I say, okay, on one level, sure. But on what domains are we talking about? In terms of the maritime domain, yes, it opens up new opportunities for transit. There's a lot of other variables. An excellent piece just came out in Nature by Jackie Dawson and members of her team at the University of Ottawa, really a consortium of experts from all across Canada, showing that Canada's internal waters, the Northwest Passage, right, may be having a reduction in sea ice coverage in a general sense, but that actually a lot of the breakup of the ice in the Central Arctic Ocean is flushing down in between Canada's Arctic islands and making it an actually more precarious or uncertain operating environment. So I think in some cases, we can overgeneralize about the accessibility of the region driven by climate change. And when we talk about the sort of threats that are going to pass through the Arctic, which in my mind are sort of the most acute conventional military kinetic threats, I'm not sure, because I'm not an expert on these things, but I'm not sure that, bombers coming to the air identification zones or intercontinental ballistic missiles, sort of a legacy threat, one that's still very much with us, or next generation cruise missiles or glide vehicles are affected by climate change. So the fact that North America is still a target and that these delivery systems have passed through the Arctic, in my mind, is almost agnostic to climate change. So I always want to kind of say, in the case of many of these threats, it's actually technology more than climate change that, in my mind, is increasing the importance of us dealing with these kind of threats. And this is something that's come out of NORAD and U.S. Northern Command in many of the statements that have been made before U.S. subcommittees on defense. So, in a way, counterintuitively, climate change is also making for a much more complicated operating environment for the Canadian Armed Forces. So if we think about the shoulder seasons, the fall and the spring, break up and freeze up, these are actually the seasons where it's most difficult to travel, to have mobility within the Arctic, particularly we're talking about on the ground. So land forces, and also it's a season where there's lots of fog and conditions that make it difficult for aircraft, fixed wing, rotary wing, right, to be able to operate in the region. So as those shoulder seasons become longer, and that's associated with climate change, operations become more challenging. So when I think of climate change in the Arctic, I think about not inherently that it's going to be more accessible. It may actually be more challenging, and there might be more uncertainty in terms of the operating environment. At the same time, I think as much as a lot of the commitments have focused on new infrastructure builds, I think a lot of the legacy infrastructure upon which we rely for mobility and force projection in the Arctic whether it's airfields, whether it's certainly ice roads are affected by warming temperatures, but also existing gravel or hardened roads. These things are going to they're going to cost us a lot more as Canadians, quite frankly, to maintain. So to make sure that as we're thinking about climate change, we're not only thinking about, accessibility and new outside, access to the region, but what this means for operations in the region now, and also realizing that a lot of these changes are having a dramatic effect on the ability for Northern Canadians, particularly Indigenous peoples, living in communities to travel between communities or to provide for their families by berry picking or hunting or whatever, that all of this uncertainty really compounds a lot of dynamics that, yes, they're not conventional military security, but they are human security, they're environmental security. And I'm not even going into yet, you might have a question about emergency response and forest fires and these other drivers that are coming from climate and environmental change that are a tremendous draw on Canadian resources, including the CAF, to go and respond, and which I think is something that has been identified, and certainly by the former CDS, General Eyre, right, flagging how much domestic emergency response, Operation Lintus missions, how much of a drain that is on the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think we really have some big questions in Canada to think about what the responsibilities the CAF should be in emergency response.
How do you foresee the role of Arctic Indigenous communities evolving in security and defense discussions? And what measures can be taken to ensure their perspectives are adequately represented in policy making?
Excellent, Josh. So I think the first step is it's investing in relationships. So it's imperative that we talk a lot about culture change in many dimensions. One is a culture change on the part of DND, Department of National Defense, and the Canadian Armed Forces to be more proactive in sharing information with Indigenous governments, with Indigenous leadership. So enabling and empowering those leaders to understand what's happening in the Arctic defense and security space so that they can come to tables prepared to have discussions. It requires more lead time than is traditionally, I think, been given to make sure that there is fulsome engagement and consultations with Indigenous rights holders in the North. It means rethinking some of the mechanisms that are in place for information exchange between territorial governments, Indigenous governments, and the Department of National Defense. And I say all this because there's an explicit commitment in the defense policy update that came out in April saying that we need to do things differently. That in essence, the defense team has to think about new ways of meaningfully engaging with Northerners and really leveraging a tremendous amount of Indigenous expertise and knowledge in the region. So I think if we're looking for an immediate, area where we can work towards that, it's through the Canadian Rangers. So I want to emphasize to your audience, Canadian Rangers is not an Indigenous program, right? These are members of the Canadian Armed Forces Reserves serving in a very distinct form of service as members of communities who are expected to serve in their communities and know their homeland. But by providing more resources to support the Canadian Rangers in what they're doing, and this is in terms of training, in terms of making sure that their pay and damage compensation claims for their own personal equipment that they use and so on are carried out in an efficient and timely manner, right? These can reinforce some of the existing relationships that exist between the Canadian Armed Forces and Northern communities and community members. And I see that as one that is such a brilliant success story of a uniquely Canadian solution to how do we have a positive military presence in remote communities that otherwise would not be efficiently or effectively, having a military presence. So I think that that's one component, but certainly at this stage, there's also a lot within the sphere of defense procurement. Never a strong point for Canada, I might say, but also figuring out opportunities for a very vibrant Indigenous business community across the Arctic and North to figure out opportunities to participate in some of these projects that have been announced, but also to help to frame how we can look for investments, smart investments in defense that can also have benefits for civil society. So thinking about investments in defense infrastructure, and telecommunications that actually are very attentive to and cognizant of identified northern needs. Not every investment in defense is going to have a civilian spin-off benefit. Certainly, whatever hangars are being constructed for the F-35s, I think we're going to be finding them to be incredibly secure facilities that are not going to allow civilians to come and access sort of conveniently. But at the same time, thinking about what kind of supply chains we're reinforcing and investing in, and figuring out where we can make sure that the northern benefits are factored in is really going to be key. And that's something that's being called for by northern leaders, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. As
I was perusing the news this morning, as I often do, I noticed an article, which you probably saw as well, citing that earlier in the month, the Canadian warship, the HMCS Regina, on its first Arctic patrol, encountered the Chinese polar research vessel, the Shulong 2, in the Bering Strait off Alaska. D&D confirmed this, and it highlighted that the increased presence of global competitors in the Arctic. Other spokespeople emphasized that the growing activities of China and Russia, who are probing Canadian infrastructure and potentially collecting intelligence as the Arctic becomes more accessible due to rapid warming, which we discussed. So in light of these recent encounters, what specific steps would you say Canada could take to address or counteract the increasing activities of foreign military and research vessels in the region? And what do they mean for our security?
It's a bit of a tricky one in that I don't think the primary instrument for countering ostensibly scientific platforms, recognizing, of course, that much of the research bathymetric hydrographic data that's being collected by these kind of vessels is dual use, right? And we must assume that information is being fed back to the Kremlin or back to the PLA Navy and Beijing establishment sort of thing. But that said, these are scientific platforms. And as long as they're operating in compliance with international law and domestic laws, this is an issue where we don't want to end up overzealously denying activities that we ourselves would be undertaking in other parts of the world. So we don't want to use the Arctic, and particularly a military instrument, to respond to what otherwise are regulatory or law enforcement issues. So when I see, I've written about certainly the Long and how the scientific research expeditions by the Chinese Polar Research Institute have become a way for China to ostensibly normalize its presence in the Arctic over the last 10 to 15 years. So what in 1999 was shocking when the Long showed up in the port of Tuktoyaktuk in our Western Canadian Arctic, that was a big, I think, shock to a lot of people that the Chinese were active in the region, had these kind of capabilities. I think at this stage now, they brought on their third polar icebreaker. So the amount of activity going on, especially in Antarctica, has certainly picked up. But we've seen a normalization or a regularization. I think it's really important that we be vigilant through all channels in making sure that whatever China is doing, the research is being shared in a transparent manner. And I think we're all well aware that is not something that China is renowned for. Same thing for Russia, right? These are not countries that are known for being transparent. But that we be really vigilant in monitoring what kinds of activities are being undertaken, scrutinizing what kind of scientific data is being collected, and also looking at, where possible, who is on these vessels and whether these are causes for concern. So the United States talks about, as its emphasis in its recent Arctic defense strategy, the need to monitor and respond. And I keep thinking in these cases, right, we're in a moment where we must be vigilant. We need to be carefully monitoring what kind of activities are going on, and we need to think about what instruments we need to have to respond. And my thought is the Canadian Armed Forces is very much a force or an instrument of last resort in responding to things like scientific expeditions. Canada has a whole bunch of other tools, right, in our broader toolbox that I think we would use first before we're resorting to the Navy. Now, that stated, we do have a marvelous capability coming online through the Arctic and offshore patrol vessels, and these actually are quite a sophisticated whole of government platform where we can have fisheries enforcement officers, we can have Transport Canada officers, we can have Royal Canadian Mounted Police, federal policing officials, so other departments and agencies as well that help to really signal that when suspect or maligned foreign activities are going on in or adjacent to our waters, that we're not only monitoring them, that we actually do have capabilities to respond proportionately. And I think one of the considerations here is make sure we don't unnecessarily militarize some of those responses when in fact they're best situated as law enforcement would, or basically us making sure that people are compliant with our Canadian regulations, which we are of course going to exercise and enforce as a sovereign act.
Well, Whitney, I think this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you for joining us today on the podcast. Great to have you on for the first time. And your insights, I think, are really valuable for our audience and for the community. So we appreciate your thought leadership and we appreciate your expertise. I think we've covered the waterfront here, everything from NORAD to encounters between China and Canada, our sovereignty and investments in the Arctic. So thank you so much for joining me. It's been great having you on, and we hope you can come on again soon.
That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next time.